What's going on, VoiceOver warriors and keyboard ninjas? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Logic channel EQ and what some of the parameters mean and how they work. Now, if you need to see how to put an effect on a track, whether that be the Logic EQ or compressor or any of the other stock Logic plugins or third-party plugins you may have installed yourself, check out the tutorial on instantiating an effect. There is a link to that in the description below, but this time we're just going to go a little bit more in depth on the EQ, so let's dive in.
Channel EQ, checked. Main vocals, dialog.
Alright, so here we are in the Logic channel EQ. So first we're going to go over the interface a little bit, and then we'll get into the parameters and how they work. Alright. So once you open up this interface, you are going to see
toolbar button.
You have a toolbar,
bypass, checkbox,
and you have a bypass button. Now be aware, in the plugin window, this is only when you have the plugin window open. When this bypass button is checked, that means the plugin is engaged. So just be aware of that. So right now this plugin is engaged.
Factory default pop-up button.
This factory default pop-up button is where you can choose some presets.
Previous button.
And continue here. These previous and next buttons will take you to the next or previous preset as well, just like the left and right brackets will.
Next button. Compare, dimmed unchecked, check view, menu button.
With this view menu button, I'd recommend VO spacing on this and selecting controls view if you don't already have your plugins in controls view. So if things look a little bit different for you than they do in this tutorial, then come back to this view menu and select the controls view option.
Link unchecked, check table, low cut on / off, unchecked checkbox. Selected.
So now we get to the star of the show here. These are the parameters for the Logic EQ. And by the way, we got this on the main vocal track. Once again, I'd like to say thank you to Seren for letting me use this track for this demonstration, because otherwise you might have to hear me sing and that would not be pretty. So I'm going to give this a quick listen and dive into what these EQ parameters are.
Pretty faces make me jealous easily. You said don't worry, and for some reason I listened.
Alright, so there we go. That's a little taste of what we're going to be working with.
Low cut on / off, unchecked checkbox.
The Logic EQ has 8 bands, and each of these bands serve different purposes. We have a low cut and a high cut, a low shelf and a high shelf, and then 4 what Logic call peak bands. The low cut and high cut are what are generally referred to as filters. The low cut filter is also known as a high pass filter, and that will cut the lows or allow the highs to pass through, hence why they use the same name. Logic refers to as a low cut, so that's the term we're going to use going forward. But just know, if you're looking at third-party EQ and it says high pass, that is the same thing as a low cut. All right. So the way most of these EQ bands work are going to be pretty similar. There's going to be a slider to select your frequency, a slider to select the gain. The gain is how much you cut or boost that frequency. And then what you call a Q, and the Q will adjust how wide the band is, but it works a little bit different for the filters. So, of course, the first thing we have here is the frequency.
Low cut frequency, 20.0 Hz slider, 0% slider.
And this starts at 20 Hertz. And now, most EQs will cover 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz or 20,000 Hertz. 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz is the general range of the human hearing, 20 Hertz being the extreme low end, and 20,000 Hertz or 20 kilohertz being the extreme high end. So this low cut is starting at 20 Hertz. And so what you want to do is slide this up until you hear the voice or the source is getting too thin, and then you might want to back it off a little bit. This is useful on things that may not have a lot of low end content, so a lot of stuff in your projects besides maybe the kick and bass, though you can still make use of it on kick and bass as well. So I'm going to go up and enable this because I don't think the low cut's on by default.
Low cut on / off, unchecked checkbox.
Yep, it's not, so I'm going to VO space on this to turn it on.
Check.
So now you see the low cut is enabled.
Low cut frequency, 20.0 Hz slider, 0% slider.
I'm going to play this and then adjust the low cut frequency. So let me interact with this.
20.0 Hz, in slider.
All right. So now I'm going to play the project.
22.0 Hz, 24.0 Hz, 26, 28, 30.0 Hz.
Probably not going to hear much of a difference down here, but as I turn this up, you'll probably start to notice more of a difference.
32.0 Hz, 34.0, 36.0 Hz, 38.0 Hz, 40, 44.0, 46.0 Hz.
And for some reason I listen.
And some of the things you might want to pay attention to in a scenario like this, where you're EQing a vocal and there's an instrument behind it, is as you're cutting out some of the lows in the voice, you'll start to hear the instrument come in more. So if you listen, you'll start to hear like the piano might be starting to roll in more.
Pretty faces
48.0 hertz, 50, 55, 60.65.0 hertz, 70, 80.8, 90, 95.0 hertz.
Around here, you start to hear that a little bit. I'm going to roll this up some more.
100 hertz, 110 hertz, 120 hertz.
Let me take this up a
100,
little.
124 hertz, 125 hertz.
Pretty faces
Auto slider.
me
Low cut on slash off. Checkbox.
I'm back on the on off. So right now the low cut's on.
And for some reason I listen. Pretty faces
If I turn it off,
me jealous easily. You said don't worry, and for some reason I listen.
so you see there's a lot more low end in the voice now, but you can't hear the piano as well. So if I turn this back on again,
you said don't worry, and for some reason I listen. Pretty faces make me.
and you see it's letting the piano come through a little bit more. So that's how you can use the low cut. And the extreme lows on a voice can be a little muddy. You notice that it cleaned up, it made her sound a little bit clearer with the low cut on, taking out some of the extreme lows in her voice, and also you start to hear the piano a little bit better. All right, so the next control in
Low cut
here,
frequency. Low cut slope. 12 decibel slash October pop-up button.
the slope. So instead of a gain for the low cut and the high cut, you're going to have a slope. And what the slope means is what is the steepness of the cutoff. So, for example, this says
Low cut frequency. Low cut slope. 12 decibel slash October pop-up button.
12 dB per octave. So basically, every octave, this is being reduced by another 12 dB. So what's an octave? So let's say, for example, we have this set to 120 hertz, right? So at 120 hertz, half of that would be 60 hertz. So from 120 hertz, it's being rolled off by about 12 dB. At 60 hertz, it'll be rolled off by another 12 dB. So it's going to be rolled off by 24 dB at 60 hertz and lower. At 30 hertz, you'll add another 12 dB. And so at 30 hertz, it'll be rolled off by about 36 dB, and so on and so forth. So that's what this roll off is referring to. Let's say if we set this to 24 dB
Menu
per
6 item
octave.
18. 24. Low cut slope. 24.
Now it's being rolled off at 24 dB at 120, 48 dB at 60 hertz, and so on and so forth. So the cutoff is steeper. It's reducing way more the lows at this point. So if I play this now,
Pretty faces make me jealous easily. You said don't.
you see that is taking out a little bit more of the lows. It's adding some clarity. And there's a balance to this. You got to figure out to your ears how much of those lows you want to take out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because you can use the other bands in this EQ to add some I's or remove some other frequencies as well. So you don't have to worry about making everything happen here. All right, so that's how the slope works. The next control we have to look at
Low cut Q
is
factor. 0.71 slider. 28.3% slider.
the Q factor. And the Q factor for the filters adjust the resonance. And resonance basically means, in this case, without getting into anything too technical and fancy, that you're going to boost the frequency at the cutoff to some extent. So in this case, we have it at 125. So if it's starting to sound a little thin, you can use this to boost at about 125, and it will add back in some of the fullness without some of the muddiness that you've removed. So it's going to compensate for some of the extreme lows that we're reducing right here. So if I interact
Low
with
cut
this,
0.71 slider.
and this is another subtle one. So I'm going to play this and then adjust this up.
Pretty faces
In slider.
make
1.20.
me jealous easily.
2.10.
You said don't worry, and for some reason I listen. Pretty faces make
You see now the vocals are sounding a
me
little full again.
jealous easily.
1.20.
You said don't worry, and for some reason I listen.
So there's 120.
Pretty faces make
0.71.
me jealous easily.
070.
You said
This is
don't
where it's
worry,
kind of at its
and for
thinnest.
some reason I listen.
And if we take that down further, you'll hear that it's taken out a little bit more of the lows. So let's push this back up.
Pretty faces make reach out less easily.
We'll leave it there for now. All right, so you kind of get the idea, and let me actually solo this.
Toggle channel.
Pretty faces make
So this is just the voice.
reach out less easily.
0.71.
You said don't worry, and for some reason I listened.
0.71.
Pretty faces make reach out less
1.20.
easily. You said don't
2.10.
worry, and for some reason I listened.
You really hear it there at 2.10.
Pretty faces make
Drop back in some lows.
reach out less easily.
So that's what the low pass filter does.
1.20.
All right, let's leave that there.
Out of slider.
So let's move on over to
Low shelf on slash off. Checkbox.
the low shelf. And the low shelf is similar to the low cut. The difference is with the low shelf, you can boost or cut. Now, the way a shelf works is a low shelf is cutting or boosting everything below the frequency that you select. A high shelf will be cutting or boosting everything above the frequency that you select. So
Low shelf frequency. 75.0 hertz slider. 19 in.
let's set this a little higher here.
75 in slide 88 90 100 hertz 110 hertz 100 100 140 100 100 100 100 190 200 hertz.
Let's start around 200
slider.
hertz. Since we already used the low cut, I just wanted to demonstrate in a slightly higher part of the frequency range. But you can just boost this, just turn the gain up, and then go through and sweep through the frequencies until you find something that sounds good or something that sounds really bad. And you can cut it if it sounds bad, or you can leave it boosted if it sounds good. So what I'm going to do here is, now that I got it at 200, I'm going to go down to the gain.
Low shelf Q factor. 1 point. Low shelf gain. 0.0 decibel.
And turn this up a little
In.
bit.
Low 0.0 decibels.
Pretty faces
Oops.
make
Let's unsolo that.
pretty faces
In slider.
make
Plus 1.0
Turn this up a
decibels.
bit.
reach out
Plus
less
2.0 decibels.
easily.
Plus 3.0
You
decibels.
said don't worry,
Plus 4.0
and for
decibels.
some reason I listened. Pretty faces make
Plus 5.0 decibels.
reach out less easily.
And you see now that's bringing back in some fullness.
Out of slider.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to sweep just to give you an idea how to sweep through the frequency.
Low shelf frequency. 200 hertz slider.
You're back on the frequency. We got the gain
In
turned
slider.
up.
220 hertz. 200
So
hertz.
let's go through some of these frequencies.
Pretty faces
220 hertz.
make reach out
240
less
hertz.
easily. You said don't
260 hertz.
worry, and for some reason I listened.
So right around here, there's some fullness. You hear some of the low end coming back in. And this can either be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what the sound you're going for. But this can also get really muddy as well if you boost it too much.
Pretty faces make reach out less easily. You said don't worry, and for some reason I listened.
So a little muddy to me. So I'm going to actually pull this down.
Out of slider. Low shelf gain.
Go down to the gain.
Plus 5.0 decibels. Slider. In slider.
I'm going to bring this back down to 0.
Pretty faces
Plus 4.0
make
decibels. Plus 3.0
reach out
decibels.
less easily.
Plus 2.0 decibels.
You said
Plus
don't
1.0
worry,
decibel. 0.0
and for some
decibels.
reason I listened.
And now I'm going to take this down into the minus to show you what this sounds like if you start to cut this frequency a little bit.
Pretty faces make
Minus 1.0 decibels.
reach out less
Minus 2.0
easily.
decibels.
You said don't worry, and for some reason I listened. Pretty faces make reach out less easily. You said don't.
And there you go. If I
Pretty faces
Minus 3.0 decibels.
make reach out less easily.
You see, that takes out some of the thickness, but it also gives it some clarity. So once again, the trick here is to find the balance. Are you looking for thickness or are you looking for clarity? And go from there.
Pretty
Minus 2.0
faces
decibels.
make reach out less
Out of slider.
I'm going to leave that on -2.
Low shelf Q factor. 1.00 slider.
Same thing with the shelves. The Q factor kind of acts similar to how the Q does on the low cut and high cut filters.
In.
Let's interact with this.
1.00.
Pretty faces
slider.
And we can boost this.
1.80.
reach out less easily.
2.00.
You said don't worry, and for some reason I listened.
1.90.
Pretty faces
1.80.
make
And this time I'm going to take the Q factor down just to show you what that sounds like as well.
pretty faces
1.00.
make
0.56.
reach out less easily. You said don't worry.
There you go. You see it's taken some more of that out because it's boosting less at the shelf frequency. And once again, remember the low shelf is affecting that frequency and everything below it. If it's a high shelf, it goes the other way. It's boosting or cutting everything above the shelf frequency. All right.
Auto slider.
Next up is the peak frequency. And there are 4 peak bands in the Logic EQs. So the peak bands are going to be where you have a little bit more free range to adjust frequencies. You select your frequency, you adjust the gain so you can boost or cut that frequency. If it's in the positives, as you've seen earlier, it's boosting. If it's in the negatives, it's cutting. And then the Q factor allows you to adjust how wide that frequency is. So right now,
Peak 1 frequency, 100 Hz slider, 23.8% slider.
peak 1 frequency is set to 100 Hertz, but you're not really only affecting 100 Hertz. You're affecting the frequencies around it. And how wide that band is could mean you're affecting 90 Hertz and 110 Hertz. Could mean you're affecting 50 Hertz and 150 Hertz. However, it's not affecting everything evenly. So the more you boost or cut, the more effect it has on the initial frequency, but it starts to drop off to the frequencies on the side. So let's just turn this up a little bit to look at a slightly different frequency range
In
here.
100 Hz. In slider. 150. 18,000 Hz. 17,000. 3,000 Hz. 600 Hz. 420. 280, 200, 200, 200, 340 Hz. 320 Hz. 300 Hz. Auto slider.
And a good way to use something like a peak band is kind of what we were talking about before. Just turn the gain up, sweep until you find something you like or don't like. If you find something you don't like, then you want to try cutting at that frequency. If you find something you like, then I'd normally bring it back down to 0 and just start boosting slowly just to find where the sweet spot is for the boost that I want to use. So we got this at 300. Let's interact with this. Let's go ahead and play our project.
In slider, plus 1.0 decibels, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4, plus 5.0 decibels, plus 6.0 decibels.
And for some reason I listen.
All right, so that's boosting 300 Hertz by 6 dB.
Auto slider.
Let's go
Peak
back
1
up
frequency,
here
300 Hz slider. In
and
300 Hz.
sweep through the frequency range.
Pretty faces.
In slider, 320 Hz. 340 Hz.
Me jealous
360 Hz.
easily.
380
You
Hz.
said don't
400 Hz.
worry, and for some reason I
420 Hz.
listened.
440 Hz.
Faces make
460 Hz.
me
400,
jealous
500, 500, 600 Hz.
easily. You said don't
650
worry,
Hz.
and for some reason I listened.
So I'm going to leave that around 650.
Auto slider.
But that just kind of gives you an idea. And now the thing to remember too is you got to be careful here because an EQ, think of it as a volume control for all these different frequencies. So you're turning up 650 Hertz by 6 dB right now, right? So it's going to affect the volume. And when things get louder, things generally tend to sound better to our ears. So you have to keep that in mind when you're adjusting this, and also remember to level match. And we'll get into that in a second here before we're done with the tutorial. But you got to remember before you're done, you want to adjust the output gain of the plugin and then bypass it and listen to it on bypass to see how it sounds, to make sure that the decisions you made are still good decisions. So, all right, let's go down here to the gain
Peak 1
control.
gain, plus 6.0 decibel slider, 62.5%.
We got this at 6 dB. Let's
In, plus 6.0 in slider.
reset this to 0.
Plus 1.0.0
And let's turn this up or down.
Pretty faces
plus
make
1.0 decibels.
me jealous
2.0 decibels.
easily. You said
Plus 3.0
don't
decibels.
worry, and for some reason I
Plus
listened.
4.0 decibels.
Pretty faces
And then I'm
Plus
going to turn this
3.0
down.
decibels.
me
Plus 2.0,
jealous
plus 1.0.0 decibels.
You
So
said
we started at
don't
0.
worry, and for some reason I listened. Pretty faces
Minus 1.0 decibels.
me jealous
Minus 2.0 decibels.
You said don't
Minus
worry,
3.0
and
decibels.
for some reason I listened. Pretty faces
Minus 4.0 decibels.
me jealous easily.
Minus 3.0
You
decibels.
said don't worry, and for some reason I listened.
So there you have it. You can cut or boost at that
minus
frequency.
0 plus 2.0
Let's turn this
plus
back
3.0 plus 4.0 plus
up
5.0
a little
plus
bit
6.0 decibel. Out of
just
slider.
to help illustrate the point with the Q factor.
Peak 1 Q factor 0.60 slider 26.
The Q factor is, as I was saying earlier, is going to affect the bandwidth. So how much around 650 hertz is this adjusting? Is this going to be just like 650 and 655 and 645, or is this going to be like 650 and 700 and 600 hertz and even wider? So the lower this number is, the wider the bandwidth is. The higher this number is, the narrower the bandwidth is. So
In peak
let's interact with
0.60
this.
slider 9 bars 1 B 1 tick. In slider
And if I take this down,
0.35.
Don't worry, and for some reason I listen. Pretty faces
0.20.
make me jealous easily.
9 bars.
and if you hear right now, as I bring it down, you hear it's getting fuller and bassier. And because I did such a wide Q, I pulled the Q down. It's casting a wider net. Because I did such a big boost, 6 dB boost, it's also boosting more the low frequency below 650. And it's also boosting more the frequencies above as well. So it's just casting a wider net in the boost.
9 bars 1 B 1
Pretty
tick.
faces make me jealous easily.
0.35 0.60.
You said don't
And this is where we started at
worry, and for some
0.60.
reason I listen.
And if I take this up, it'll narrow in on the band some more.
1.00
Me jealous easily.
1.80.
You said don't worry, and for some reason
And now it's starting to focus in on more and more around 650 hertz. And it's still relatively wide because we're only at 1.80, and you can crank this Q up a lot and see what it does. So let's take this back down again, and I'm going to solo this so you can hear a little bit more what's going on here. Now, you also don't want to get used to doing EQ in solo because you need to hear how everything blends together. So don't be afraid to solo stuff to get a feel for what's going on, but then take it out of solo to make your final decision. All right, so I just got it soloed.
pretty faces make
1.00
me jealous
0.60.
easily. You said don't
0.35.
worry, and for some reason I listen.
0.20.
Pretty faces make me jealous easily.
So there you have it. That's using the peak bands. And there are 4 peak bands that apply a lot of the same principles to the other peak band. Don't feel like you have to use all 4 of them, but definitely as you get more comfortable with the EQ, you'll start to learn when to leave them off, when to leave them on. Remember, each band has a checkbox before the frequency where you can bypass that band. So you can bypass that band, take it out, see if you like it with or without, etc., etc. The high shelf pretty much works the same way as a low shelf. It just does the opposite. It's going to boost everything above that frequency, and the high cut is going to roll off the highs, and then you can use the Q to kind of boost the frequency a little bit at that cutoff frequency. So that's a brief overview of the Logic EQ. The last thing I want to go over before we get out of here is level matching. So I'm going to go down here. Let me stop interacting
On up
with
slider.
this.
Peak 2 on peak 2 for peak 4 peak high shelf on high shelf high cut on high cut frequency high cut slow high cut Q master gain 0.0 decibel slider 50% slider.
You got the master gain, and the master gain is the output level for this EQ. As I said earlier, think of the EQ as a volume control for each of these bands. So if you do a lot of boost or cut, your bypass signal and the signal with the EQ on might be drastically different. And you can use this gain control to level match to bring down or turn up the output of the EQ so it's as close to the unaffected signal as possible. And then you can bypass on or off to see if you like the decisions you're making, and then you can tweak a little bit more if you feel you need to. So what I'm going to do here is get out of here for a second.
Out of table.
Gonna go back over to the top of this window, so via home.
Main vocals. Toolbar button. Bypass. Check. Checkbox.
And I just VO right arrow over to bypass. I'm going to bypass
Uncheck.
this.
Bypass. Check.
Pretty faces make me jealous easily.
And let's turn this back on.
Pretty faces make me jealous easily.
So you see that gets considerably louder when it's on. So let's jump back over to the table. So VLN.
Table. Master gain. In
Interact
table.
with the master gain.
In slider.
And let's turn this down a little
minus
bit.
1.0 minus 5.0 decibels.
Pretty faces make
All right, stop
Out of
interacting.
slider. Out of table.
Let's jump
Main
over
vocals.
to the bypass button.
Toolbar. Bypass. Check.
I just press VO home to jump to the top of the window after I stop interacting with the table, and then I press VO right arrow to go back over to the bypass button. So this is with it on.
Pretty faces make me jealous easily. You said don't worry, and for some reason I listen.
Back on.
Pretty faces make me jealous easily. You said don't worry, and for some reason I listen.
And off.
Pretty faces make me jealous easily.
And I guessed right, about 5 dB would get it about even with the signal when it's bypassed. And that's the process you want to go through. Level match it, bypass it, turn it on, make sure it sounds better when it's on. If it doesn't sound better when it's on, tweak it a little bit more. And also, don't be afraid to try some of the presets. I wouldn't just pick a preset and leave it on that, but take a preset as a starting point and then adjust some of these frequencies based on now that you know what each of these different parameters in the EQ does. So that's it for this brief overview of using the EQ and what the parameters do. So go grab the Logic Channel EQ, instantiate it on a track, start playing with it, start getting familiar with it, and start getting comfortable using it on some of your tracks. All right, that's it for this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you found this useful and helpful. As always, please like and subscribe. Share this with someone you know that's new to recording, new to Logic, and new to using EQs. And until next time, as always, happy recording.